He stood there and said nothing. Imagine the man you love, the father of your children, the person you have given everything to, standing 6 feet away from you. You are 8 months pregnant. You are surrounded by your closest friends, and his mother just handed you divorce papers, and he won't even look at you. That is the moment Claire Weston's world ended. Not with a conversation, not with a confession, not even with an argument, just silence. A man who couldn't meet the eyes of the woman carrying his child. But what Bradley Ashford didn't know, what his mother, his new girlfriend, and every single one of those 42 guests didn't know, was that the woman he just discarded was secretly worth $30 billion. And she didn't cry for long. She planned. What this story will teach you: betrayal only destroys you if you let it be the final chapter. For some women, it's just the beginning. If you have ever loved someone who turned out to be a completely different person than you thought, this story is for you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And before the story ends, tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have walked out quietly or said something they would never forget?
A woman is standing in the doorway of a $40 million penthouse, gazing out over Manhattan. The city beats below her, vibrant, with light, ambition, and an energy that never rests. She has a phone pressed to her ear. On the other end, a man is begging, sobbing. His voice is cracking, with the unique desperation that only comes when you finally understand the magnitude of what you've thrown away. "Please, Claire, I made a terrible mistake. I'll do anything." She pauses, her gaze shifting to the marble countertop. A set of divorce papers sits there, preserved in a simple black frame. It's not a trophy, it's a reminder. She takes a deep, slow breath. When she finally speaks, her voice is calm, steady, and completely final. "You should have loved me." She hangs up the phone, sets it down gently next to the frame, and stands perfectly still for a moment, watching the city lights stretch out to the horizon like a million tiny promises. But this is not where our story starts. Let's go back 6 months. The morning of the baby shower began like most beautiful disasters do, with sunshine, hope, and the quiet assumption that everything was going to be perfect. Claire Weston was standing before a full-length mirror in the master bedroom of the Ashford estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. She turned to the side, studying her reflection. She was 8 months pregnant with her third child, a boy this time. The dress she had chosen, a soft ivory wrap with delicate lace on the sleeves, didn't quite fit the way it had just 3 weeks ago. She reached behind her back, straining to pull up the zipper, but her fingers could barely touch it. She sighed, picked up her phone, and called Sophie Bennett. Sophie answered immediately. "Don't tell me you're still trying to get into that dress. It fit last week," Claire said, still struggling. "Claire, you're 8 months pregnant. That zipper is a suggestion, not a command. Wear the blue one." Claire started laughing. It was a genuine, deep laugh that came from her core, warm and completely uninhibited. She didn't realize it at the time, but it was the last real laugh she would have for a very, very long time. She changed into the blue dress. It was loose, flowing, and forgiving. She gave herself one final look in the mirror and whispered a phrase her foster mother, Ruth, used to tell her when she was just a girl bouncing between group homes in Ohio. "Never show all your cards at once. You keep your ace hidden where no one can find it." That piece of advice had guided her entire life, her business, her investments, and her marriage. Claire Weston wasn't just a small business consultant who had married into a wealthy Connecticut family. She was the sole proprietor of Lakeview Capital, a holding company with assets valued at $30.2 billion. It included 340 commercial properties in 12 states, a venture capital fund with investments in 47 tech companies, and a controlling share in 3 publicly traded corporations. No one knew. Not Bradley, Not his mother Victoria, not a single person in the Ashford family had a clue that the woman they looked down on was one of the wealthiest people in America. And that is exactly how Claire wanted it. Because when she first met Bradley Ashford III at a charity event 6 years earlier, she saw how money changed people. She saw how their eyes would shift, how their smiles turned into calculated performances. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for what she had. So, she kept her empire a secret, managed quietly by Sophie Bennett, her best friend and the chief operating officer of Lakeview Capital. It was the smartest move she had ever made, and as she would soon discover, it was also the most dangerous. The baby shower was set up on the south lawn of the Ashford estate. There were white tents, hydrangeas and crystal vases, and a 3-tier cake with light blue frosting. 42 guests were there, a mix of Claire's friends, Bradley's business associates, and Victoria's socialite circle. The food was catered by the country club. Everything looked perfect. Claire made her way through the crowd, greeting her guests, accepting hugs, and laughing at jokes about her size. She saw Bradley standing near the bar, his phone held tightly to his ear, his back to the party. He had been distant lately, colder than usual, but she kept telling herself it was just stress about his job and the new baby. She was telling herself a lot of things. Victoria Ashford, her mother-in-law, was holding court by the gift table. She was 62 years old, with silver hair, styled in a perfect chignon, and she was wearing a cream-colored suit that likely cost more than a car. Victoria had never approved of Claire. She had made her disapproval clear in subtle ways, like introducing Claire only as Bradley's wife, instead of by her name, or asking about Claire's little consulting job, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. But today, Victoria was acting strangely warm. She had complimented Claire's dress. She had gently touched her arm. She had smiled, and there was something about that smile that made Claire's stomach clench. The moment it all fell apart was at 2:17 in the afternoon. Claire would always remember the exact time, because she had just checked her watch, wondering when they should cut the cake. Victoria stood up from her chair and tapped a silver spoon against her glass of sparkling water. The delicate chime sliced through the cheerful chatter, and the entire lawn fell silent. "If I could have everyone's attention," Victoria announced, her voice filled with the practiced confidence of a woman used to being in charge. "I would like to present Claire with a very special gift today. Something that has been long overdue." She reached into her Hermes bag and withdrew a large manila envelope. She walked over to where Claire was sitting in a white wicker chair, surrounded by piles of wrapping paper and tiny baby outfits, and she placed the envelope right in her lap. "Happy baby shower, my dear?" Claire looked down at the envelope. It felt heavy, official. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the flap and slid out the documents inside. The words were a blur at first, but then they came into sharp focus. Petition for dissolution of marriage, filed by Bradley Robert Ashford III, including a custody claim for all 3 children. She was being served with divorce papers at her own baby shower, in front of 42 people. The lawn was completely silent. Someone dropped a glass. Claire heard it shatter on the stone patio, but the sound seemed distant, as if it were happening in a different reality. She slowly looked up at Victoria. Her mother-in-law's expression was calm, almost serene, like someone who has waited a very long time for a moment that has finally come. "It is a kindness, really," Victoria said. "We are freeing you. Bradley has found someone more suitable, someone from our world. I'm sure you understand. You were always a lovely girl, Claire, but lovely does not build dynasties." Claire's eyes found Bradley. He was standing by the French doors, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. He refused to look at her. "Bradley?" she whispered. He didn't say a word. Victoria continued, her voice as smooth as silk. Oh, and one more thing. Bradley and Morgan will be announcing their engagement next month. We wanted to give you some time to make other arrangements. Morgan Hale, Bradley's ex-girlfriend, the interior designer. She was the woman who had shown up at 3 of the last 4 Ashford family dinners. The one Claire was always told was just an old friend. A tight knot formed deep in Claire's belly, sharp and sudden, stealing her breath. She gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her pregnant stomach. The manila envelope, filled with divorce papers, slipped from her lap and fell onto the grass. Sophie rushed to her side in a second. "Claire! Claire, breathe!" Someone in the crowd yelled, "Somebody call 911!" By then, Claire was on her knees, one hand planted on the ground, the other pressing hard against her abdomen. This was happening in front of 42 people. Her mother-in-law was watching it all with a cold, quiet look of victory. The last thing Claire saw before the paramedics took over was Victoria, still standing by the gift table, casually adjusting her bracelet like nothing was wrong. The ambulance ride was a dizzying mix of wailing sirens, harsh fluorescent lights, and the steady mechanical beeping of a fetal heart monitor. Claire just laid on the stretcher, gripping the rail, her eyes locked on the ceiling. The paramedic next to her was asking questions, but his voice sounded distant and warped, like it was coming from underwater. "Ma'am, how far along are you?" 8 months, she managed to say. "Have you had any complications before this?" "No." "We are going to take excellent care of you," he said. "Just try to keep breathing." She did as he said, breathing in and out, over and over. She did it not because he told her to, but because a quiet, steady voice deep inside her, a voice that sounded just like her foster mother, Ruth, was telling her to. "Keep breathing, baby girl. You have gotten through far worse than this." At Greenwich Hospital, the doctors managed to get her stabilized. The contractions were brought on by stress. It was not actual labor. While the baby was in distress, the treatment was working. They put her on mandatory bed rest with an intravenous drip. A nurse came in with a cup of ice chips, a thin blanket, and the kind of gentle, sympathetic smile people give you when they have no idea what else to do. Claire lay there, all alone, in the stark white hospital bed, staring at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling. She was counting the tiny holes in each panel and had gotten to 47 when Sophie walked into the room. One look at Sophie's face told Claire everything she needed to know. "How bad is it?" Claire asked. Sophie pulled a chair up next to the bed. She never sugarcoated anything, which was one of the things Claire valued most about her. In their 15 years of friendship, Sophie Bennett had always told Claire what she needed to hear, not what she wanted to hear. Bradley emptied the joint account, every penny, $2.3 million. He did it this morning, right before the shower. Claire, this was all planned. Claire shut her eyes. What else? Sophie held out her phone. The screen showed an Instagram post by a woman named Morgan Hale. It was a picture of Morgan and Bradley at a restaurant, taken just the night before. Morgan was smiling, her head resting on Bradley's shoulder. The caption simply said, "New beginnings," followed by a red heart emoji. The comment section was a flood of congratulations. Claire stared at that photograph for what felt like an eternity before handing the phone back to Sophie. What else is there? Sophie paused for a moment. Thomas Kincaid called. Victoria's lawyers filed an emergency motion this afternoon. They are arguing that you are an unfit mother, citing emotional instability and a lack of financial resources to care for the children. They are demanding that temporary custody be transferred to Bradley right away. Claire tried to sit up, but the intravenous line in her arm tugged sharply. They can't do that. They submitted sworn statements from 3 witnesses who were at the baby shower. They are all claiming you had a violent outburst and then collapsed into a hysterical fit. They are trying to paint you as unstable, Claire, and so far, the judge has only heard their side of the story. 3 witnesses. Claire knew exactly who they would be. Patricia Lawton, Margaret Everts, and Diane Caldwell. They were Victoria's bridge partners and fellow board members at the Greenwich Country Club, women who had barely said 10 words to Claire over the last 6 years, yet were now suddenly experts on her fitness as a mother. Claire grabbed her own phone and dialed the number for the Ashford estate. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. It was not Bradley or Victoria, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, it's Claire. Could you please let me speak to Amelia and Nate? There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. I am so sorry, Mrs. Ashford. Mrs. Victoria has given us instructions that you are not to have any contact with the children until the court makes a decision. The phone slipped from Claire's fingers, landing with a soft thud on the hospital blanket, its screen still glowing. She was trapped in a hospital bed. Her unborn baby was at risk. All of her money was gone. Her children had been taken from her. Her reputation was being systematically destroyed in court documents, and all of it had unfolded in less than 12 hours. Sophie reached out and gently took her hand. What are we going to do? Claire stared blankly at the ceiling. For the first time in many years, her voice trembled as she said, I don't know. They sat together in the quiet hum of the hospital room for a long time. The only sounds were the steady beeping of the machines and the distant buzz of activity from the hallway. The ordinary noises of other people's emergencies. And in that heavy silence, something inside Claire Weston began to change. It did not happen all at once or in a dramatic fashion. It was a slow, subtle shift, like the first crack forming in a frozen lake, invisible to anyone watching, but completely irreversible. The following 3 days were the longest of her life. She was forbidden from leaving the hospital, and she was not allowed to see her children. Bradley refused to answer her calls. Then she was served with a temporary restraining order, a complete fabrication by Victoria's legal team that barred her from the Ashford property. The order cited concerns for the safety of the minor children, which was just a legal way of saying that Victoria had enough money and powerful connections to make any lie sound like the absolute truth. On the 3rd night, at 2 in the morning, Claire was all alone in her hospital room. The lights in the hallway had been dimmed. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic pulse of the fetal monitor, as steady and sure as a metronome, keeping time for a song that hadn't been written yet. She rested a hand on her stomach and whispered to her unborn son, I'm sorry. I am so, so sorry that I brought you into all of this. I really thought that if I was just good enough, if I just loved hard enough, that it would be enough. She began to cry, but not the polite, controlled tears of a woman trying to keep her composure. These were real, gut-wrenching sobs, the kind that come from a place so deep inside you that you thought it was empty, but it turns out to be overflowing with every emotion you've held back for years. And then she stopped. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and reached for her laptop on the bedside table. She opened it and called Thomas Kincaid. He answered on the 2nd ring, his voice as calm as ever. Before going into private practice, Thomas Kincaid had been a federal prosecutor. He was not a man who rattled easily. Thomas, Claire said. Her voice was completely different now. It was steady, cold, and precise. Activate Lakeview. There was a brief pause. All of it. Everything. And Thomas, I want you to pull every single one of the Ashford financial records. Every company, every trust, every offshore account. I know things about that family that they have no idea I know. I'll have my team on it first thing in the morning. She hung up and immediately called Sophie. So, what's the plan? Sophie asked. Step 1. We get my children back. Step 2. We show the Ashfords exactly who they were married to. She paused for a moment. There is no step 3, because after we finish step 2, there won't be anything left of them. 2 weeks went by. Claire was finally released from the hospital with strict instructions to rest, an order she chose to interpret very loosely. She moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Stamford that Sophie had found for her. It was a world away from the grand Ashford estate, but it was hers. It was clean and, most importantly, it was quiet, which was all she really needed. Thomas Kincaid quickly put together a legal team of 5 attorneys. They immediately filed countermotions on every single front, requested an expedited hearing on the custody order, and got to work tearing apart the case that Victoria's lawyers had so meticulously built. The first hearing took place on a Tuesday morning at the Stamford Superior Court. Claire wore a simple gray dress with no jewelry, and her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked exactly like what she was, a pregnant mother who just wanted her children back. Victoria arrived in a black town car, flanked by 2 lawyers from Hartford's most expensive firm. She was dressed in a white Chanel suit and carried herself with the air of a woman who had never lost a single battle in her life. Thomas Kincaid stood before the judge, holding a thick stack of documents in his hand. Your Honor, he began, the emergency custody motion that was filed by the petitioner is based on sworn statements from 3 witnesses. These witnesses claim to have seen the respondent exhibiting violent and unstable behavior at a family event on June 14th. We would like to present evidence showing that these statements were, in fact, coordinated and completely fabricated. He placed the documents on the judge's bench. They were text messages, 14 of them, all recovered from the phone of Patricia Lawton, one of the 3 so-called witnesses. They were messages exchanged between Patricia and Victoria Ashford on the morning of the baby shower, just hours before the divorce papers were ever served. The messages were undeniable. Victoria had instructed Patricia on exactly what to write in her statement. She had coached her on the specific language to use, with phrases like, make sure you mention that she was screaming, and use the word erratic. The judge will respond to that. The judge read every single message in complete silence. When she finished, she looked up at Victoria's attorneys. Counselors, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Were you aware that your client coordinated these witness statements? Victoria's main lawyer, a tall man named Richard Holt, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Your Honor, we received those statements in good faith. We had no grounds to doubt their authenticity. The judge was having none of it. I am throwing all 3 witness statements out. I am also canceling the temporary custody order, effective immediately, and I am ordering the petitioner's legal team to make Mrs. Victoria Ashford available for a deposition within 30 days about these communications. Claire finally let out a long breath, the first full one she had taken in 2 weeks. That afternoon, she went to the Ashford estate to get Amelia and Nate. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, was waiting at the door, the children's overnight bags already by her side. She remained silent, but the look in her eyes told the whole story. Amelia, who was 4 years old, rushed to Claire, throwing her arms around her legs. Mommy, I missed you. I missed you too, my sweet girl. Nate, Amelia's twin, appeared right behind his sister. He gazed up at Claire with his large, solemn eyes. Mommy, Grandma told us you went away to a farm. Did it have horses? Claire knelt, wincing at the pain in her back, and drew him into a tight hug. No, sweetie, but Grandma just might be on her way to one very soon. Later that night, back in their own apartment, Claire tucked both children into the bed they were sharing. She stayed with them until they drifted off to sleep. Amelia was nestled against her, and Nate still held onto her hand. Even while sleeping, his small fingers were wrapped tightly around her thumb, as if he feared she might vanish again. Claire sat in the quiet darkness, listening to the rhythm of their breathing, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a sense of calm that was almost peace. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt like she was winning. She was sleeping through the night again and making breakfast for the twins. She even found herself humming a half-remembered old song that Ruth used to sing as she washed the dishes. Then, on a Thursday morning, her world came crashing down. Here is a lesson that many people learn when it is too late. Victory is the most dangerous point in any conflict. It is not that winning is bad. It is that winning convinces you the fight is over. And when you think the fight is over, you lower your guard. Claire had lowered her guard. She awoke to her phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was not a phone call. It was a flood of notifications. First dozens, then hundreds. She grabbed the phone and tapped on the first one, a news alert from a New York-based tabloid. The headline blared, "Billionaire's wife concealed a $30 billion fortune from her husband. Ashford family demands justice." An icy chill spread through her chest as she skimmed the article. While it was not completely factual, it was dangerously close to the truth. Someone had revealed the link between Claire Weston and Lakeview Capital. The story listed the holding company's name, mentioned its real estate assets in several states, and pointed to venture capital funds. The reporter did not have all the details, but they had more than enough to completely shatter her secret life. Sophie called 30 seconds later. "Have you seen the news?" "I'm looking at it right now," Claire answered. "Who could have leaked this?" "I have no idea. Only 4 people were supposed to know about Lakeview. You, me, Thomas, and his team." Claire sat on the side of her bed, her thoughts spinning wildly. The twins were still asleep in the other room. The only sound in the apartment was the relentless buzzing of her phone. Notification after notification, signaling the collapse of the world she had so carefully constructed. By noon, the situation was a full-blown disaster. Within hours, Bradley's attorneys submitted a new legal motion, claiming fraud in the marriage. They argued that Claire had knowingly hidden assets from her husband. Under Connecticut law, this could drastically alter the divorce terms. They were now demanding half of Lakeview Capital, a sum of $15 billion. But the court filing was not the worst of it. The truly devastating blow came at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Victoria Ashford was a guest on a nationally broadcast morning talk show that had been taped earlier. She sat on a plush beige couch opposite the host, dressed in a soft pink dress and a string of pearls. With her hands neatly folded in her lap, she was the very picture of a heartbroken matriarch. "We brought this young woman into our home," Victoria began, her voice shaking with carefully rehearsed emotion. "We provided her with everything. We treated her like one of our own. And now, we find out she has been deceiving all of us for 6 years, hiding billions of dollars and leading a secret life. What sort of person would do such a thing?" She paused, dabbing a tissue at the corner of her eye. What kind of mother would lie to her own husband? The segment became a viral sensation in less than an hour. Social media immediately turned against Claire. The comments were vicious. "She's a gold digger playing 4D chess. She's just as bad as they are. Those poor kids need a real mother. A con artist in a designer dress." In her apartment, Claire watched the media storm unfold on her laptop. The screen's blue glow illuminating her face in the dark room. Sophie was sitting next to her. We have to figure out who the leak is, Sophie insisted. Claire was silent for a long time before she picked up her phone to call Thomas Kincaid. It rang 5 times, but he did not answer. She tried again, with the same result. An hour later, Thomas finally called back. His voice was different, strained and guarded. Claire, there's something I have to tell you. Victoria's legal team contacted me last week. They offered me $20 million to give them your financial information. Claire felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room, and I told them absolutely not. But Claire, he hesitated. They also went to my assistant, David, and David accepted their offer. David Morrison, 26 years old, just 2 years out of law school. He had been with Thomas's firm for 14 months and had full access to Claire's case files, her corporate documents, her asset reports, everything. How much? Claire asked. They gave him $300,000. He sent them the files last Tuesday. Claire shut her eyes. The man she relied on most in her professional world had been loyal. Thomas had refused. But Thomas's firm had a vulnerability, and that vulnerability had betrayed her for a tiny fraction of her fortune. Thomas, fire David. Report him to the state bar. Then I need you here at my apartment tonight. We have to create an entirely new strategy. She ended the call and faced Sophie. The Ashfords know everything, Sophie said. It was not a question, but a statement of terrifying fact. They know what I possess. Yes. Yes, Claire responded. But they have no idea what I know. And at this moment, that is the one edge I still hold. That evening, long after the twins were asleep, Claire sat at her kitchen's table, a forgotten cup of cold tea beside her. She stared blankly at the wall, her mind a whirlwind, replaying every choice she had made over the past 6 years. She went over every secret she had guarded, and every time she had stayed silent when she should have spoken. She had concealed her wealth because she wanted to be loved for herself, not her money. Now, that very choice was being twisted into a weapon to ruin her. The shield she had built for her own protection had become the tool of her destruction. She remembered something Ruth always said. When a person reveals their true nature, believe them immediately. But if they show you that same nature a second time, you better make sure they do not get a third chance. The weeks that followed were a systematic and brutal assault. Victoria Ashford was not content with just winning the divorce. She aimed to utterly destroy Claire Weston, legally, financially, and personally. With everything gone, Bradley went for full custody again, this time claiming fraud. His lawyers painted a grim picture. They argued that Claire's choice to hide $30 billion was a sign of deep-seated deception. It proved she was psychologically unfit to be a mother. They demanded that she only see her children with a supervisor present. At the same time, Victoria's public relations team went on the attack. They planted stories with any news outlet that would take them. Claire Weston was not just a liar, they said. She was a con artist, a manipulator who had schemed her way into the Ashford family from the start. One story called her a foster kid from Ohio who spotted her chance and grabbed it. Another labeled her the most expensive catfish in American history. Soon, Claire's business partners started calling Sophie, not with support, but with worry. 2 huge real estate deals collapsed in 1 week. Investors were running from the negative press. A venture capital firm in Boston pulled out of a joint project without a word. The message came through loud and clear. Claire Weston was now toxic, and money, no matter how much of it she had, avoids toxic people. Then came Morgan. Morgan Hale moved right into the Ashford estate just 3 weeks after the baby shower. She started redecorating the master bedroom. She threw a dinner party for Victoria's friends. She posted pictures of herself all over social media. making breakfast in Claire's kitchen, strolling through Claire's garden, and sitting in Claire's favorite chair. Claire did not see any of this directly, having deleted her social media. But the twins saw it. And children, no matter their age, see and absorb everything. One Sunday night, after a weekend stay with their father, Amelia and Nate returned home, unusually quiet. While Claire was in the kitchen making dinner, Nate appeared in the doorway. He just stood there, hands tucked in his pockets, staring at the floor. Claire asked, "What is wrong, honey?" "Daddy says Morgan is going to be our new mommy." Claire's hand froze in midair, the wooden spoon hovering right over the pot. She did not turn around. She refused to let him see the look on her face. "Nobody's replacing your mommy, Nate. You have one mommy, and she is right here. But Daddy said so. I know what Daddy said. And I love your daddy. But sometimes Daddy says things that are not true. This is one of those times." Nate gave a slow nod, the kind kids give when they are not totally sure, but desperately want to believe you. He walked over to her, pressed his small face into her leg, and she finally set the spoon down to wrap her arms around him. The final crushing blow landed 4 days later. A courier showed up at Claire's apartment holding a new stack of legal documents. Bradley was now officially asking the court to strip her of custody, leaving her with only supervised visits. The court filing pointed to her secret double life as proof of a dangerous pattern of lies that could emotionally scar the children. That evening, long after the twins were in bed, Claire sat on the living room floor. She was not on the couch, and not in a chair, but on the floor. Her back was pressed against the wall, her knees were drawn up to her chest, and her arms were wrapped tightly around them. She had cried all her tears out. She had emptied herself in that hospital room 3 weeks before, and the well had been dry ever since. Sophie found her sitting there. She had a key to the apartment and had stopped by with some takeout and a bottle of wine that Claire could not touch because of the pregnancy. Sophie placed the bag on the kitchen counter, took one look at Claire on the floor, and slid down to sit right next to her. "Talk to me," Sophie pleaded. "I spent 10 years building a life so that no one could ever have power over me again. So I would never again feel like that helpless foster kid with nothing. And now they are using the very thing I built to take my children from me." Sophie was silent for a long moment. Then she glanced around the apartment, at the bare walls, the used furniture, and the pile of legal papers on the counter. "You know," Sophie said, "for a woman who is worth $30 billion, this apartment is seriously depressing." Claire almost cracked a smile. Almost. The penthouse just felt too much like a statement. There is a middle ground between a $30 billion penthouse and a witness protection program hideout. A sound escaped Claire's lips that was part laugh and part sigh. In that one small, silly moment, something inside her shifted. It was not everything, and it did not happen all at once, but it was a start. "I have been playing defense this whole time," Claire said. "Yes, you have. My secret is out now. There is nothing left for me to protect." "Correct. So now it is time for me to find theirs." Sophie turned, a spark in her eyes. "Now you are talking." Claire hired a private forensic accounting firm. She did not go through Thomas, whom she trusted, but now needed to keep at a distance. She used a different contact, a woman by the name of Laura Prescott, who operated a small, private investigation firm out of White Plains. Laura did not have advertisements. She did not have a website. All she had was a phone number and a solid reputation, and she had earned them both. Claire gave Laura a single, clear instruction. "I want to know everything about the Ashford family's money. Not the parts they show to the world, but the parts they keep hidden from it." Laura's team spent 9 days digging. On the 10th day, she presented a 47-page report. Claire read it through 2 times. The first time, she was in total disbelief. The second time, she felt a feeling that was very close to pure satisfaction. The great Ashford Empire was nothing but a house of cards. Bradley's grandfather, Robert Ashford Sr., had made the family fortune in manufacturing and commercial real estate back in the 1950s and 60s. When he passed away in 1992, the estate was valued at around $800 million. That was a lot of money, but it was not the billions that Victoria loved to hint at. Bradley's father, Robert Ashford Jr., had then managed to lose almost all of it through bad investments, over-leveraged buildings, and a disastrous bet on subprime mortgages that imploded in 2008. By the time Robert Jr. died from a heart attack in 2010, the Ashford fortune had shrunk to about $40 million. Most of that was tied up in the Greenwich estate and a few commercial buildings that were mortgaged up to their eyeballs. For the last 15 years, Victoria had been desperately keeping up appearances. She used a complicated network of shell companies and credit lines, borrowing against the estate to pay for a lifestyle that screamed wealth but was actually built on debt. She threw charity galas that were funded with credit. She wore designer outfits bought on store accounts that were always past due. She drove cars that were leased, never owned. And most importantly, she had been slowly draining money from Claire and Bradley's joint accounts for years. It started with small amounts, a few thousand here and a few thousand there. Then the amounts got bigger, funneled through a shell company named Ashford Legacy Holdings, which only existed on paper. Over a period of 6 years, Victoria had secretly siphoned $4.7 million from their joint accounts. It was money that Claire and Bradley had both put in, and it was being used to keep the Ashford fantasy alive. The Ashfords were not rich. They were $47 million in debt. They needed Claire's money, specifically the $15 billion they were demanding in the divorce, not just to keep up their lifestyle, but to actually survive. Claire put the report down on the kitchen table. She picked up her cup of tea, took a small sip, and set it back down. "There is more," she said to Sophie, who was reading the report over her shoulder. "More than the fact that the family is secretly broke and has been stealing from you for 6 years." Page 31. Sophie flipped to page 31. She read it once, then read it again, and looked up at Claire in shock. "You have got to be kidding me." Morgan Hale was not just some ex-girlfriend of Bradley's who had conveniently shown back up. She was Victoria's goddaughter. She was the daughter of Victoria's college roommate, Elizabeth Hale. Victoria had known Morgan her entire life. She had been at her christening, her high school graduation, and her college graduation. The affair with Bradley had not just happened by chance. Victoria had reintroduced Morgan to Bradley 2 years ago during a family Thanksgiving dinner. She had encouraged the relationship. She had made it happen. She had been paying Morgan a monthly allowance of $25,000 for 24 months straight. The money was deposited into a personal bank account in Westchester. It totaled $600,000. Morgan Hale was not a homewrecker. She was an employee. She was a paid actress in Victoria's grand play to replace Claire with someone she could easily control. Claire closed the report. Her hands were perfectly still. There were no tears, no rage, just a powerful sense of clarity. It was the kind of clarity you get after wandering lost in a thick fog when someone suddenly flips on a giant floodlight. "Sophie, call Thomas, call Laura, and schedule a meeting for me with Pastor Jim Hartley." Sophie looked baffled. The Ashford family's pastor? Why him? Because Pastor Jim was the one who married us. And during the rehearsal dinner, I heard Victoria say something to Bradley that I never forgot. At the time, I thought I must have heard it wrong. I talked myself into believing it was about something totally different. What did she say? Claire locked eyes with Sophie. She said, "Marry the girl. Take what you can, and when I say it is time, we end it." The room fell completely silent. I heard it through a doorway. I was 6 months into a relationship with a man I was in love with, and I convinced myself I had misunderstood. I told myself it had to be about something else, maybe some business deal or a family problem, because the other possibility was just too horrible to consider. Sophie just stared at her, horrified. Claire, they planned this whole thing from the very beginning. Yes, they did. Victoria saw a woman with no family, no powerful connections, and no obvious signs of wealth, and she saw a golden opportunity. Marry the foster kid, take everything she earns, and when a better option appears, throw her away. Claire stood up. She walked over to the window and stared out at the parking lot of her apartment complex. It's not much of a view, but I am not looking at the view. The one thing they never counted on, Claire said, was that the girl from the foster system had a $30 billion fortune. And the one thing they still do not know is that I am about to deploy every last cent of it. Pastor Jim Hartley was a man of 71 years, with a crown of white hair and gentle eyes. He possessed the quiet confidence that comes from 3 decades of leading a congregation, witnessing the best and worst of human nature. He had performed Bradley Ashford's baptism and had officiated the wedding of Bradley and Claire. He had also kept a secret for 6 years, a burden that weighed on him more than he ever let on. He arranged to meet Claire at a coffee shop in downtown Greenwich on a Wednesday morning. He chose a black coffee. She had an herbal tea. They found a booth in the back, far from the windows. "I understand why you have come," he said, before she even had a chance to speak. "I have been anticipating your call for quite some time. You overheard what Victoria said at the rehearsal dinner." "I did. I was standing in the hall just outside the study. The door was slightly ajar. Victoria had given Bradley his marching orders, and her words were precise. Marry the girl. Take what you can. When I say it is time, we end it." "And you never objected." Pastor Hartley stared into his coffee. "I told myself I must have heard wrong. I convinced myself it was just a fragment of a conversation, taken out of context. But then, as the years went by, I observed. I saw the way Victoria manipulated you. I saw how Bradley began to change. And I realized I hadn't misunderstood anything at all." He looked at Claire. "Would you be willing to give a sworn statement?" She held his gaze for a long moment. "Yes. I should have come forward years ago. I am so sorry that I did not." Claire simply nodded. She didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't. But she understood. People make peace with their choices every day. They witness something terrible and invent a more pleasant version of the story because the truth carries too heavy a cost. With the pastor's statement, the forensic accountant's report, and proof of Morgan's payments, Claire finally had all the ammunition she needed. Thomas Kincaid began preparing the case. The final hearing was set for the next Thursday, but on Monday evening, just 3 days before, Claire's phone buzzed. It was Bradley. He was sobbing. This wasn't the fake crying of a man trying to get his way. It was genuine, the kind that comes in ragged breaths and broken words. "Claire, I am so deeply sorry. I know I have no right to say that, but I need you to know it. My mother, she made me do it. She was behind everything. The divorce, the custody battle, Morgan, all of it was her plan. I was just too weak to stand up to her. I was too terrified." Claire sat on the edge of her bed and listened, her hand resting protectively on her stomach as the baby kicked. "I want to come home," Bradley pleaded. "I want to end this custody fight. I want to make things right. I know I made a horrible mistake. I know how much I hurt you, but please, Claire, please, can we just meet and talk?" And that is the trap of love. Even after it has been shattered and left for dead, even when every logical part of your mind is screaming that it is finished, a small, stubborn piece of your heart refuses to let go. It whispers, "Maybe, and clings to the memory of the person they once were, not the person they have become. Claire found herself pausing. It was not because she desired to have Bradley back, but because she desperately wanted a whole family for her children. She pictured Amelia and Nate growing up with two parents sharing a meal at the same table. She longed for the storybook ending, even though she was keenly aware that fairy tales are not written by people who get served divorce papers during their own baby shower. "Meet me tomorrow," she said, her voice steady. "Peterson's Bistro, noon. We can talk." After hanging up, she remained in the darkness, letting herself feel a flicker of dangerous hope for just one moment. The next morning, Claire chose a simple dress and drove to Peterson's Bistro, a quiet place on Main Street in Greenwich. She got there 5 minutes early and requested a table in a quiet corner. She ordered a glass of water and waited. Bradley appeared exactly at noon. He looked worn out, with deep, dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled shirt. He clearly had not shaved. He had the appearance of a man who had not seen a good night's sleep in weeks. Following close behind him, moving with the cold precision of a planned operation, were Victoria Ashford, Victoria's lawyer, Richard Holt, and a woman Claire had never seen before, who was holding a small recording machine and a stenographer's notepad. It was a court stenographer. In that single moment, Claire saw the whole picture. The apology was a lie. The tears were an act. Victoria had coached Bradley, feeding him the perfect lines to lure Claire into this meeting. And now they had a stenographer here to officially record Claire's willingness to talk about getting back together. Their lawyers would use that to claim the marriage was not truly over. That would stall the divorce for months, keeping Claire's finances tied up with Bradley's legal challenges. It was all a play to give Victoria more time to bleed whatever money was left. Victoria took a seat opposite Claire and smiled. "Sit down, Claire. Let's discuss a settlement. 50% sounds reasonable, don't you agree?" Claire's eyes were fixed on Bradley. "You called me last night crying." Bradley refused to look at her, his gaze locked on the tablecloth. Victoria answered for him. "My son did what was necessary. He always does." Claire rose from her chair. She did not raise her voice. She did not start to cry. She did not throw the table over or splash water in anyone's face or do any of the dramatic things that would have given Victoria the satisfaction she craved. Instead, she leaned toward Victoria, so close that only she could hear, and whispered, "You have absolutely no idea what is about to happen to you." She turned and walked out of the restaurant, the sound of her heels clicking firmly on the hardwood floor. She never once looked back. The final hearing was only 3 days away, but Claire had no intention of waiting for a courtroom battle. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with Sophie and Thomas. A fresh pot of coffee sat between them, and the accountant's report was spread out before them like a general's plan of attack. "We have 3 moves," Claire announced, "and we are making all of them before Thursday." Thomas arched an eyebrow. "Before the hearing? That is an aggressive strategy. Victoria ambushed me at my own baby shower. She paid witnesses to lie. She took $4.7 million from our joint accounts. She paid a woman $600,000 to have an affair with my husband. And yesterday, she tried to ensnare me with a fake reconciliation." Claire looked directly at Thomas. "I am finished with being patient. I want them to step into that courtroom already defeated. Move 1. Claire had Laura Prescott's forensic accounting report delivered not to the court, but straight to the 3 banks that managed the Ashford family's biggest lines of credit: First National of Connecticut, Meridian Trust, and Hudson Valley Lending. The report laid out everything, including the shell corporations and the grossly inflated asset values. Victoria had used these tactics to obtain her loans. The report showed that the Ashford estate which Victoria had listed as being worth $32 million on her credit applications, was in reality worth something closer to $11 million once you factored in the existing debts and neglected repairs. It was straightforward bank fraud. Within 48 hours, 2 of the 3 banks had frozen all the Ashford accounts and sent letters demanding immediate repayment of their loans. The 3rd bank started its own internal investigation. Victoria's meticulously built empire of lies began to dissolve like sugar in the rain. Move 2, Claire's new public relations team, which Sophie had recommended, leaked Morgan Hale's payment history to a journalist at the Hartford Courant. It was not presented as a personal attack on Morgan or as cheap gossip, but as documented proof of Victoria Ashford's long-running campaign of manipulation and financial coercion. The story broke on Tuesday morning with a headline that read, "Mother-in-law paid mistress $600,000 to end son's marriage." The article was incredibly detailed. It featured bank records that showed the monthly $25,000 payments. It provided a timeline, proving Victoria had reconnected Morgan and Bradley 2 years before the divorce was even filed. It also included a statement from a former employee of the Ashford home who confirmed that Victoria had openly talked about her scheme to find Bradley a more suitable wife, while Claire was still living there. By Tuesday afternoon, the story had been picked up by every major news organization in the nation. The public's opinion shifted instantly. Claire was no longer seen as a deceitful billionaire. She was the woman whose mother-in-law had literally paid someone to wreck her marriage. Move 3. Pastor Jim Hartley was interviewed by a local Connecticut news station. He did not insult the Ashfords or use any harsh language. He just told the truth with the calm conviction of a man who had dedicated his life to his faith. "I have been a pastor for 30 years, he said, looking straight into the camera. "I officiated Bradley and Claire Ashford's wedding. I heard them make their vows, and I can tell you that what I saw in that family was not about love. It was about control. And I am confident that the truth will ultimately prevail." Sophie called Claire that evening, and her voice sounded happier than it had in a very long time. So, Victoria's Country Club just canceled her membership. On what grounds? Apparently, they have a rule against members who are involved in bank fraud. Claire paused. That is a very specific rule. I believe it is a new one. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Claire let out a real laugh. On Thursday morning, at the Stamford Superior Court, courtroom 4B, the corridor outside was swarming with reporters, photographers, and television crews. The Ashford divorce had turned into the most sensational legal drama in the country. It was a story that had all the elements: vast wealth, betrayal, hidden fortunes, a paid mistress, and a mother-in-law who seemed like a character from a movie, created with a personal vendetta. Claire showed up at 8:45. She was wearing a plain navy dress, no jewelry, and flat shoes because of the swelling in her feet from the pregnancy. Her hair was styled simply. She looked like a woman who had just been through a 6-week battle for her life and for her children, which was the absolute truth. Thomas Kincaid was by her side, holding 2 briefcases. He radiated the calm, intense focus of a man who had prepared for this very moment with the same level of precision as a surgeon getting ready for a complex operation, leaving no possibility for mistakes. Inside the courtroom, Bradley and Victoria were already seated on the left. Bradley looked empty. He had lost a noticeable amount of weight, and his suit seemed to hang off his frame. His eyes had the vacant, faraway stare of someone who had finally understood, far too late, that the woman sitting beside him had completely destroyed his life. Victoria sat perfectly straight, with her chin held high, but her confident facade was beginning to show cracks. Her makeup was applied more heavily than usual, likely to hide the evidence of many sleepless nights. Her hands were folded in her lap, but her fingers kept twitching, pressing into each other with nervous energy. Victoria's lawyer, Richard Holt, rustled his papers like a man who knew he was about to lose but wasn't sure by how much. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Caldwell, made her entrance. At 60 years old, she wore silver reading glasses and had an air of absolute authority. She had served on the bench for 22 years and was known for despising any kind of drama. This court is now in session. We are here for the final hearing regarding Ashford versus Ashford. Counselors, you may proceed. Thomas Kincaid rose to his feet. Your Honor, before we get to the usual topics of asset division and custody, I need to present several urgent matters to the court. These issues directly address the character and actions of the petitioner and his family, and they are all supported by a great deal of documentation. He opened his first briefcase, Item 1-1, Financial Fraud. Over the last 6 years, Mrs. Victoria Ashford has methodically drained $4.7 million from the joint accounts belonging to Claire and Bradley Ashford. These funds were moved through a shell corporation named Ashford Legacy Holdings, which has no staff, no business activities, and no real purpose. The only reason this entity existed was to illegally transfer marital assets to Mrs. Victoria Ashford for her own personal spending. He laid the bank statements before the judge. Every transaction was listed, by date, showing all $4.7 million accounted for down to the last penny. Item 2. The arranged affair. The romance between Bradley Ashford and Morgan Hale was not a random occurrence. It was deliberately set up by Victoria Ashford, who happens to be Morgan Hale's godmother. Victoria orchestrated their meeting at a family gathering 2 years ago, and then she paid Morgan a monthly sum of $25,000 for 24 months in a row. The total payments amounted to $600,000. He put the payment documentation on the bench, which included bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and a complete timeline that was cross-checked with social media activity and phone logs. Item 3. Dishonest custody filings. The emergency motion for custody that was submitted on June 15th was based on sworn testimonies from 3 individuals who stated they saw Mrs. Claire Ashford displaying violent tendencies. As this court has already discovered, those testimonies were orchestrated by Victoria Ashford using text messages where she instructed the witnesses on the exact words to use. Item 4. The truth about the Ashford finances. The petitioner's family has portrayed themselves during this case as a family of significant wealth. The truth is that the Ashford family is currently in debt for $47 million. Their Greenwich home has 3 separate mortgages. 2 different banks have put a freeze on their accounts because of fraud investigations. The Ashford empire, Your Honor, is a complete illusion. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Bradley just stared down at the table. Victoria's fingers were no longer moving. She had become completely motionless, like an animal that realizes it has been seen by a hunter. Item 5 is the testimony from Pastor James Hartley, the man who performed the Ashford wedding ceremony. Pastor Hartley has submitted a sworn affidavit confirming that on the night of the rehearsal dinner, he heard Victoria Ashford tell her son these exact words, "Marry the girl. Take what you can. When I tell you it is time, we will end it." Thomas allowed those words to linger in the courtroom. He then faced the judge. Your Honor, this was never a marriage. It was a calculated plot from the very start. Victoria Ashford intended to use Claire Weston as a financial well to be drained and then thrown away. Every move she made, From the baby shower ambush to the fake custody claims and the manufactured affair, was all part of a deliberate strategy to take away my client's money, her children, and her self-respect. He paused and reached for the second briefcase. And that brings me to the subject that the opposing legal team has mentioned time and again during this case, the matter of my client's hidden assets. Richard Holt sat up straighter. This was the moment he had been anticipating, the fraud accusation, the $15 billion assertion. Thomas continued, "The petitioner's side has described my client as a woman with very little money who married into a higher social class and then secretly built her own fortune through dishonest means. I would now like to set the record straight." He put one document on the judge's bench. Claire Weston is the one and only owner and founder of Lakeview Capital, a holding firm with independently verified assets valued at $30.2 billion. This fortune consists of 340 commercial properties located in 12 states, a venture capital fund with ownership in 47 technology startups, and a controlling share in 3 publicly traded corporations. The courtroom did not make a sound. It fell into a deep silence, the kind that occurs when a whole room of people simultaneously stops breathing. My client did not conceal her wealth to trick her husband. She concealed it because she hoped to be loved for herself, not for her money. But instead, the Ashford family tricked her into marriage by pretending they were rich when they were actually on the verge of bankruptcy. And they methodically schemed to divorce her to get their hands on assets they had no part in creating. Thomas pulled one last item from his briefcase, a document that was visibly older than the rest, with yellowed edges and a date from 6 years prior. Your Honor, I wish to submit into evidence the prenuptial agreement that both parties signed before they were married. This agreement was created at the strong request of Mrs. Victoria Ashford and was written by the Ashford family's own lawyers. It was made to shield the Ashford family assets if a divorce ever happened. He placed it on the bench. The prenup says, and I am quoting, that each party will maintain complete ownership of all assets they acquired on their own before and during the marriage, as long as those assets are kept in separately titled accounts or business entities. He looked directly at Richard Holt. Lakeview Capital is a separately titled entity. It has always been exclusively in Claire Weston's name. It was founded before the marriage and has been managed separately the entire time, according to the very terms of the prenuptial agreement that Victoria Ashford demanded. Every last dollar of Lakeview Capital is completely protected. Richard Holt's face turned pale. The exact document that Mrs. Victoria Ashford made my client sign, the one intended to keep Ashford money away from a woman she saw as beneath her, is now the same document that shields my client's $30 billion empire from the Ashford family's greed. Victoria's mouth fell open, then shut, then opened once more. No words came out. The judge looked over the prenuptial agreement. She examined the financial records. She read Pastor Hartley's sworn testimony. She took 45 minutes. Then she gave her decision. Full custody of all 3 children is granted to Claire Weston. Bradley Ashford has 0 claim to any Lakeview Capital assets, as stated in the prenuptial agreement. Claire Weston is to be paid back the $4.7 million taken by Victoria Ashford, along with punitive damages. The court is referring the actions of Victoria Ashford to the District Attorney's Office for an investigation into fraud, perjury, witness tampering, and financial manipulation. The gavel struck, and it was all finished. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining, and the air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and the early warmth of summer. Reporters crowded the steps with clicking cameras and outstretched microphones. Claire paused at the top of the steps for a second, feeling the sun on her skin. Thomas was next to her. Sophie was on her other side. Somewhere inside that building, Victoria Ashford was discovering how it felt to have the entire world see her for the person she truly was. Claire approached the microphones. She hadn't written a speech. She didn't require one. "I did not create my life to prove a point to anyone," she stated. "I built it so my children would never understand the feeling of having absolutely nothing. Today is not about getting even. It is about the truth. And the truth is very clear. You can't take something from a person that you never had a right to in the first place." She took 3 questions before walking to her car. Sophie held the door open for her. Claire got inside, fastened her seatbelt, and drove home to be with her children. The weeks that came after delivered a type of justice that brings satisfaction, not through cruelty, but through completeness. Victoria Ashford was taken into custody on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the court date. The official charges were bank fraud, perjury, and witness tampering. She was photographed as she was led away from the Greenwich mansion in handcuffs, wearing the exact same cream-colored suit she had worn to the baby shower. Her friends from the country club, the very same women who had given false testimony for her, refused to pay her bail. Patricia Lawton later said to a reporter, "I hardly knew her." Bradley left the estate just before the bank repossessed it. He found a 1-bedroom apartment to rent in Stamford. His financial reputation was ruined. The Ashford name, which once meant old money sophistication, was now seen in news headlines alongside words like fraud, scheme, and arrest. He found work at a car dealership in Norwalk, selling family sedans. 3 months after that, he mailed Claire a letter. It wasn't a legal notice, but a real letter, written by hand on ordinary paper. He didn't request money. He didn't ask for her to forgive him. He offered no excuses. He just wrote that he was sorry, that he had been a coward, and that he had allowed his mother to control every major decision in his life, including the choice to cast aside the only person who had ever really loved him. He wrote that he understood it was too late to fix anything. He was not writing to change the past, but he felt she deserved to know the truth, just one time. Claire read his words at her kitchen table, folded the paper, and placed it in a drawer without a reply. Morgan Hale granted an interview to a magazine that September. She was candid, admitting that Victoria had enlisted her help. She explained that the money, which began as a simple favor, had turned into a form of blackmail. She expressed deep shame for her actions. Afterward, she returned to her small hometown in Michigan and found a position at a local design agency. Claire felt no hatred for Morgan. In many respects, Morgan was just another person Victoria had manipulated and then thrown away. Claire's son, James, was born on a Tuesday in August, weighing 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He was healthy, with powerful lungs. He let out a powerful cry for the first 20 minutes of his existence, and Claire just held him, her laughter mixing with tears. It was the only fitting reaction to finally holding something so precious that she had come so close to losing. 6 months after the court date, Claire started a new life in Manhattan with her 3 kids. They moved into a penthouse on the Upper West Side, where immense windows offered a perfect view of Central Park. This was the exact kind of home she used to fantasize about when she was a young girl in the foster system. Back then, she would lie on a cramped bed in a crowded room in Columbus, Ohio, staring up at a ceiling covered in water stains. She would dream of what it might feel like to live in a place that was truly beautiful. By October, her face was on the cover of Forbes magazine. The title declared her the $30 billion woman nobody saw coming. The feature inside traced her entire journey, starting from the very beginning. It detailed the foster homes, the long nights she spent studying real estate law in a community college library. It mentioned the first property she ever bought at 23, a foreclosed duplex in Cleveland. She paid $47,000 for it, fixed it up herself, and sold it for $112,000. After that first success, she bought another and then another. Soon, she established a holding company, then a venture fund, and eventually, she had built an empire. That November, she started a charitable organization called the Weston Foundation. Its mission was to offer legal support, financial literacy courses, and temporary housing for women escaping abusive and manipulative marriages. The foundation opened its first location in Stamford, Connecticut. The second one opened in Columbus, Ohio, just 2 blocks away from the group home where Claire had celebrated her 14th birthday. She remembered eating a cheap cake from a gas station, making a silent wish for a life she could finally call her own. This story brings up a powerful idea. Somewhere in the world, at this very moment, there is a person being completely underestimated. Someone is sitting in a room where everyone else has already written her off. They have decided she is not as smart, not as capable, and not as deserving. But that person is quietly, patiently, and systematically creating something that none of them can even imagine. And one day, she will not have to say a word. They will simply look around and discover that the very ground they are standing on now belongs to her. Always remember this, because the people with the most power in the world are rarely the ones making all the noise. They are the ones who build their empires in silence. One evening that December, Sophie dropped by for a visit. The 2 friends sat on the terrace, wrapped up in warm blankets, and watched the city lights sparkle on the glass skyscrapers across the park. Sophie was sipping a glass of wine, while Claire had a cup of chamomile tea. She had started drinking it during her pregnancy and just never really gave it up. So, Sophie began, $30 billion, a Forbes cover, 3 gorgeous children, and the most talked about divorce in the country. What could possibly be next? Claire took a slow sip of her tea. I was thinking about buying something. A yacht, an island, a small European country? Claire let out a small smile. The Ashford estate was just put up for auction. Sophie just stared at her, completely stunned. You would not dare. I am going to, Claire said calmly, and I am going to convert it into a shelter for women. Sophie burst out laughing so hard that she spilled some of her wine on the blanket. Claire Weston, she said, you are genuinely terrifying. Thank you. That was not entirely a compliment, Sophie replied. I know. They sat there together in the peaceful quiet, just watching the city seem to breathe around them. Claire's mind drifted to all the hardships she had overcome, all the opportunities that were denied to her, and all the people who had ever looked at her and saw someone who did not matter. Then she thought about the doors she had kicked down all by herself, using her own 2 hands and her own inner strength. She thought about her stubborn, unyielding refusal to become the person that other people had decided she was meant to be. 2 weeks after that, on a Friday night, Claire was standing in the entrance of her penthouse, gazing out at the New York City skyline. Her children were sound asleep, the apartment was perfectly still, and the city lights stretched out before her, looking endless and full of energy. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the caller ID. It was Bradley. She picked up the phone. He was sobbing on the other end. Please, Claire, he begged. I made a terrible mistake. I will do anything. Just let me see my children. Let me be a part of their lives. Claire stood in silence for a very long moment. Her eyes fell on the official divorce documents sitting on a nearby table. On her office wall hung not an award, but a testament. It was proof that her absolute worst day was also the start of her real life. Bradley, you can visit the kids. They should have a father. But us? We are completely finished. Your mother sealed that deal when she served me with divorce papers. At my own baby shower, she took a breath. You should have loved me. Then she ended the call, placed the phone on the counter, and moved toward the window. Below her, the city sprawled out, a vibrant tapestry of light and noise. It was a place of 10 million different tales, 10 million people pursuing a dream, escaping a past, or creating something new. Down in that sparkling maze, a woman in a crisis shelter was holding a brochure for the Weston Foundation. In another part of the city, a young girl in the foster system was looking up at a ceiling with water stains, imagining a future that truly belonged to her. And Claire Weston stood there, looking out at it all. She whispered it to the open air, to the entire world, to the lost girl she once was and the powerhouse she now was. They thought I was a nobody. They assumed I had nothing to my name. They humiliated me with divorce papers during my baby shower, treating me like I could be thrown away. But they failed to grasp one crucial truth. The most formidable person is often the one who says the least. Because while others are busy talking, she is busy creating an empire. As the city hummed with life far beneath her, Claire Weston, 32 years old, a loving mother to 3 children, a former foster child from Ohio, and the silent architect of a $30 billion enterprise, switched off her office lights and headed home to her kids. The turbulent chapter was closed, the final score was settled, and the life she had carefully constructed for herself, the one that was truly hers, and that nobody could ever dismantle, was just getting started. If this story resonated with you, please pass it along to someone who needs a little hope. And never forget, being quiet does not mean you are weak. It means you are planning your next move. Please note, our team puts great care into researching, developing, and editing every story to provide you with powerful narratives and valuable life lessons. Each word is chosen with a specific goal: to entertain, to uplift, and to show you that your own journey matters. We appreciate you spending your time with us. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community